Chris Hipkins.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. And Mr Chairman, first can I start by complimenting the Minister of Revenue who's just taken his seat on the very polished way he seamlessly transitioned from defending a previous Labour government to defending the current National government. I think I'll probably leave my comments simply at that. I do, however, want to pick up the point made by Craig Foss and the irony in Craig Foss standing up in the House in this debate and talking about the failed finance companies, a national member of Parliament talking about the failed finance companies and the people who had lost their savings, given that they've had 2.5 years to do something about that and have done absolutely nothing. They've done absolutely nothing, but then that could have something to do with the fact that half of them used to work for the failed finance companies. That could have something to do with it. And it's a bit rich for them to say, oh, we're going to deal with the failed finance companies by hocking off the state-owned enterprises, because that's effectively what Craig Foss argued in this House. Mr Chair, I want to pick up the issues around KiwiSaver and particularly around the changes to the tax credit that this government are basically going to be cutting in half. But before I do that, I actually want to pick up a comment from the Minister of Finance's speech that he delivered to the House yesterday, and people will find it on page 27. It also relates to KiwiSaver, where he states the government will require agencies to fund the cost of KiwiSaver and some state sector retirement schemes for their employees. This will generate savings of $650 million. And I think we should think very carefully about what that actually means. What that actually means is that those state sector agencies who are now going to have to pay their share of the cost of KiwiSaver are effectively having their funding cut by $650 million. That's a funding cut to those agencies of $650 million. So if you're if somebody is working in a large social policy area where the salary costs are high, for example, education or health, their funding is being cut. It's, in real terms, their funding will be cut because they will now have to meet the cost of the employer contribution to KiwiSaver. That's a real terms funding cut. So any talk that this government is saying about increasing funding for areas like health and education, a big chunk of it is already taken up by the other changes that they're making in the area of superannuation, and they're not being upfront and transparent about that. To come back to the member, so it's a sort of a triple whammy, because if we come back to the issue of the members' tax credit here, take somebody in the education field who signed up for KiwiSaver, a teacher, for example, who may have signed up to KiwiSaver. What they're going to find is that their member tax credit gets cut in half by the government. It will go down, clause 7 of the bill addresses this, it will go down from $1,042.86 to $521.43. So basically their member tax credit gets cut in half. Then for their employer contribution to KiwiSaver, they find actually the funding for other parts of their work is being cut, because suddenly the money to fund their employer contribution has to be found from somewhere else because the government has hacked away at that as well. So they're getting a double whammy there. They're getting a double whammy there, because if the government are taking $650 million out of the government, the employer side of the contributions for KiwiSaver, that has to come from somewhere else. And I see the Minister of Revenue shaking his head, and I simply turn his attention to page 27 of the budget documents, the Minister's speech. If I've interpreted that wrong, I would welcome him standing up and clarifying that, because I think that's the only way it can be clarified. If the government is requiring agencies to fund the cost of KiwiSaver, saving $650 million, that money has to come from somewhere else. So that has to be a cut in real terms. And if I've interpreted that wrong, I look forward to the Minister of Revenue's clarification of that and his contribution to this debate. Mr Chairman, the government went into the last election promising New Zealanders that they could afford tax cuts and nothing else would change. There'd be no changes to KiwiSaver other than the changes that they had foreshadowed in their election manifesto. They wouldn't cut working for families. They wouldn't cut interest-free student loans. They have broken those promises in this year's budget. Here we go again. Mr Chairman, here we go again, particularly when it comes to retirement savings, because the National Party have a very proud history of taking very good savings schemes introduced under a Labour government and ripping the guts out of them, because that's exactly what Rob Muldoon did in the 1970s after a very good savings scheme was put in place by the Norm Kirk Labour government. Rob Muldoon bribed New Zealanders with their own money in order to win the 1975 election and sabotaged New Zealand's savings for over a decade, 2 decades after that. The last Labour government started to deal with that by introducing KiwiSaver, and once again, Mr Chair,
Chris Hipkins.
And once again, Mr Chair, we're seeing the National Government ripping the guts out of it. This is the National Party's pattern when it comes to savings. It's a bit rich for Bill English to stand up in this House and bemoan our poor savings records when what he has done as a Minister of Finance is consistently undermine it. First thing he did, cut KiwiSaver in half, from 4% to 2%, cut funding for the New Zealand Superannuation Fund, stopped putting away the funding to pay for the baby boomer retirement, stopped doing that, and then turned around and said, oh, we've got a terrible record of saving for retirement. Well, the government aren't leading by example. But actually this government never lead by example. They tell everybody else that they've got to stomach cuts, and they're never willing to cut the funding the money that they spend on themselves, of course. They're happy to have new BMWs and new carpet and so on. They're not willing to lead by example, and they're not willing to lead by example when it comes to savings. And they're not willing to lead by example when it comes to savings. The Labour government led by example when it came to savings. We set up the KiwiSaver scheme and we put the member tax credits in it and the kickstart. And we led by example when it came to savings by setting up the Cullen Fund, the New Zealand Superannuation Fund, to pay for the baby boomer retirement. Both things that this national government have kicked the guts out of. Both things that this government are kicking the guts out of and hacking into. Mr Speaker, this budget has no vision, no real vision for the future, no real plan to get New Zealand moving, no real plan to make sure New Zealanders can live a comfortable and safe retirement. It's not there. It's not there. I've read it. I spent the evening last night sitting in the House reading through the documentation. There's no plan there. This has got to be one of the blandest budgets. All they're doing is cutting. Cut here, cut there, cut here, cut there. Lots of cuts, lots of pain, but no real gain. And New Zealanders are going to be at home and they're going to be saying, where's the gain, where's the plan? The government are asking them to stomach all these cuts, but they're not seeing any light at the end of the tunnel. They're not seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. But this government have mismanaged the economy. They've taken it from a $5 to $7 billion surplus every year to one of the biggest deficits ever recorded in New Zealand's history. And that's what you get with Bill English as the Minister of Finance. He failed when he was the Minister of Finance the first time around, but in the last national government, and he's failed again in the tenure of this government. And that's one of the reasons why New Zealanders are going to vote this government out at the coming election, because I tell you what, the feedback that's been coming overwhelmingly in the last couple of days, that people have changed their mind about National because of what they're doing to KiwiSaver, because New Zealanders know how important KiwiSaver is to the future of this country, and this government are kicking the guts out of it. This government are kicking the guts out of KiwiSaver, and I think that's totally wrong. It's short-sighted, and that pretty much sums up the government's approach. They're also getting into working for families. What was their promise before the last election? What was their absolute promise? John Key said, we won't touch working for families, John Key told New Zealanders. Hang on a minute, I think there's even a pledge card with that on it, that they won't touch working for families. It was on a pledge card. It's not even worth the paper that it's written on, that little pledge card that John Key had around. My commitments to you, it was headed up. And I think the National Party now, after this budget, have broken just about every one of them. I don't think there's a single commitment left on that pledge card with John Key's signature on it that he hasn't broken. He's broken almost every one of them, and I think that's absolutely outrageous. And that's one of the things that New Zealanders are going to be keeping in mind when it comes to voting at the next election. They can vote for a party here, the Labour Party, that keeps its promises and makes promises that we know we can afford, or a government over there, the national government, promise whatever they need to get themselves elected before an election and then do whatever they want once they get the Treasury benches. Nothing sums that up more than the two major changes being made in this part of the bill, which are the cuts to KiwiSaver, kicking the guts out of the government's contribution to KiwiSaver, saying to New Zealanders, we want you to save, but we, the government, aren't willing to do our bit. and cutting working for families, even though they promised they wouldn't do that. Working for Families, another excellent initiative introduced during the term of the last Labour government, an initiative that lifted hundreds of thousands of New Zealand children out of poverty, something that we on this side of the House are incredibly proud of and will continue to defend right the way to the very bitter end, because Working for Families is a good policy. It recognises the fact that those families raising kids face higher costs, and we as a society should help with them.